Good morning and happy Friday. About once a section, we will take some time to read through the book. So this is our first time doing that, so I may spend a little bit more time trying to pick it apart when we're in class. I've attached this reading. However, some of the PDF has not been very user-friendly depending on which device that you're using. So I'll read aloud. If you're having trouble hearing, we'll try to fix that as we go through. I'll speak right into the microphone. But Chapter 15, Section 2. On May 24th, 1854, the people of Boston erupted in outrage. Federal officers had seized Anthony Burns, a runaway slave who lived in Boston, to send him back to slavery. Abolitionists tried to rescue Burns from the federal courthouse. The city leaders attempted to buy his freedom. So if we're in class, I'd say, well, what's an abolitionist? And then take a hand, and here we go. Hopefully you would now know abolitionist is someone fighting to end slavery or abolish it. All efforts failed. Local militia units joined the Marines and the cavalry in Boston to keep order. Federal troops escorted Burns to a ship that would carry him back to Virginia and into slavery. In a gesture of bitter protest, Bostonians, don't see that word very often, draped buildings in black and hung American flags upside down. So I liken a lot of what we are seeing now into the unrest in some of our cities. However, as we try to make those connections, we'll see what actually led the United States into a civil war. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required all citizens to help catch runaways. Anyone who aided a fugitive could be fined or imprisoned. People in the South believed the law would force Northerners to recognize the rights of Southerners. Instead, enactment of the law led to mounting anger in the North, convincing more people of the evils of slavery. After passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, slaveholders stepped up their efforts to catch runaway slaves. They even tried to capture runaways who had lived in freedom in the North for years. Sometimes they seized African Americans who were not escaped slaves and forced them back into slavery. We're turning the page. Resistance to the law. In spite of penalties, many Northerners refused to cooperate with the law's enforcement. The Underground Railroad, a network of free African Americans and whites, helped runaways make their way to freedom. So if you thought of the Underground Railroad like maybe I did when I first heard the possibility as an actual railroad or kind of like a subway, that's very inaccurate. However, these people helped them get to their freedom. So anti-slavery groups tried to rescue African Americans who were being pursued or to free those who were captured. In Boston, members of one such group followed federal agents shouting, "Slave hunters! There go the slave hunters!" People contributed funds to buy the freedom of African Americans. Northern juries refused to convict those accused of breaking the fugitive slave law. The next paragraph. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Franklin Pierce, a New Hampshire Democrat who supported the Fugitive Slave Act, became president in 1853. Pierce intended to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, and as his actions hardened the opposition. In 1854, the dispute over slavery erupted in Congress again. The cause was a bill introduced by Stephen A. Douglas, an Illinois senator who had forged the Compromise of 1850. Hoping to encourage settlement of the West and open the way for the Transcontinental Railroad, Douglas proposed organizing the region west of Missouri and Iowa as the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Spoiler alert, they would eventually be Kansas and Nebraska that you know today that are states. Douglas was trying to work out a plan for the nation to expand both the North and the South, and one that they would accept. Instead, his bill reopened the conflict about slavery in the territories. Because of their location, Kansas and Nebraska seemed likely to become free states, because both lay north of the 36-degree, 30 minutes north latitude parallel that we talked about a couple of sections ago. the line established in the Missouri Compromise as the boundary of slavery. Douglas knew that Southerners would object to having Kansas and Nebraska become free states because it would give the North an advantage in the Senate. They would get more votes. As a result, Douglas proposed abandoning the Missouri Compromise and letting the settlers in each territory vote on whether to allow slavery or not. He called this idea popular sovereignty, allowing the people to decide. Passage of the Act. Many Northerners protested strongly. Douglas's plan to repeal the Missouri Compromise would allow slavery in areas that had been free for more than 30 years. Opponents of the bill demanded that Congress vote down the bill. Southerners in Congress, however, provided solid support for the bill. They expected that Kansas would be settled in large part by slaveholders from Missouri who would vote to keep slavery legal. With some support from Northern Democrats and the backing of President Pierce, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in May of 1854. Now, if we're discussing this, we maybe look at Kansas, what we know it today, decide whether it would be a slave state or a free state. That's right. And then I'd say, why? And you'd say, oh yeah. So we can't really fill that in very well. But what we're looking for is Kansas is mostly a farming state. And we've already agreed that a lot of the southern states needed slavery because of the active farms that were there. Division grows. Northern Democrats in the House split almost evenly on the vote, revealing deep divisions in the party. Many Northerners became convinced that the compromise with the South was no longer possible. Sam Houston, senator from Texas, predicted the bill would convulse or upset the country from Maine to the Rio Grande. Conflict in Kansas. Right after passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups rushed supporters into Kansas. In the spring of 1855, when elections took place in Kansas, a pro-slavery legislature was elected. Although only 1,500 voters lived in Kansas at the time, more than 6,000 voters cast their ballots in the elections. Thousands of pro-slavery supporters from Missouri had crossed the border just to vote in the election. Some politicians would say that happens all the time. Anymore. And that's even today. These Missourians traveled in armed groups and became known as border ruffians. Soon after the election, the new Kansas legislature passed laws supporting slavery. One law even restricted political office to pro-slavery candidates. The anti-slavery people refused to accept these laws. Instead, they armed themselves, held their own elections, and adopted a constitution that banned slavery. In January of 1856, rival governments existed in Kansas, one for and one against slavery. Each asked Congress for recognition. To confuse matters even further, Franklin Pierce and the Senate favored the pro-slavery government, while the House backed the forces opposed to slavery. Here's a map there of all the extra territories that we labeled the other day, actually. On the next page. Bleeding Kansas. With pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in Kansas arming themselves, the outbreak of violence became inevitable. In May of 1856, 800 slavery supporters attacked the town of Lawrence, the anti-slavery capital. They sacked the town, burned the hotel and the home of the governor, and destroyed 2 newspaper offices. Soon after, forces opposed to slavery retaliated. Again, thinking about the movements that we see in the news almost every day. Now, one can debate whether they're fighting for something as, I guess, evil as slavery. However, I think both sides of the issue will be one that we will be able to debate when we come back in person. John Brown, a fervent abolitionist, believed God had chosen him to end slavery. When he heard of the attack on Lawrence, Brown went into a rage. He vowed to strike terror into the hearts of pro-slavery people. One night, Brown led 4 of his sons and 2 other men along the Pottatomie Creek, where they seized and killed 5 supporters of slavery. More violence followed as armed bands roamed the territory. Newspapers began referring to Bleeding Kansas and the Civil War in Kansas. A civil war is a conflict between citizens of the same country, or state in this case. Not until October of 1856 did John Geary, a newly appointed territorial governor, stop the bloodshed in Kansas. He suppressed guerrilla forces and used 1,300 federal troops. Violence in Congress. The violence that erupted in Kansas spilled over into the halls of Congress as well. Abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a speech entitled "The Crime Against Kansas." Sumner lashed out against pro-slavery forces in Kansas. He also criticized pro-slavery senators, repeatedly attacking Andrew Butler of South Carolina. 2 days after the speech, Butler's distant cousin, Representative Preston Brooks, walked into the Senate chamber. He hit Sumner again and again over the head and shoulders with a cane. Sumner fell to the floor unconscious and bleeding. He suffered injuries so severe that he did not return to the Senate for several years. The Brooks-Sumner incident and the fighting in Bleeding Kansas revealed the rising level of hostility between the North and the South. So as we look at how most people felt, the country was divided. They were divided among families and divided among states. So this unity was an issue that they were going to be working toward. Hope you enjoyed the reading and were able to not fall asleep. Have a good rest of the day.